Well, welcome everyone to today's keynote. So first I want to thank Cornell University's Migration Initiative for hosting this discussion. So this initiative is actually, it's really exciting because we're focusing on this planet in motion. And so the initiative is trying to understand the causes and consequences of how living things are moving and migrating across this planet. So today's talk in particular is part of our Reimagining Citizenship speaker series. And so this is one of many activities that is being hosted through the Migrations Initiative. And I welcome you all to check out the full range of events and activities on the Migrations webpage at migrations.cornell.edu/learn. And you'll find a number of different exciting opportunities, things like a film series through Cornell Cinema, as well as a new podcast series called Migrations, A World on the Move. So please join us in the future again. So now I'll move on to today's speaker, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Farnsworth. So Andrew received his bachelor's degree from Cornell University in Natural Resources He received a Master's of Science degree from Clemson University, focusing on zoology, and then his PhD back here at Cornell in ecology and evolutionary biology. Now, given that Andrew has been a birder since he was 5 years old, it's very fitting that he's landed back at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where he currently is a senior research associate. So over the years, Andrew has focused a lot of his energy on studying migration, bird migration, right, and trying to understand what's driving that. Today, you'll be hearing about one of his new projects the last several years that he's been developing called BirdCast. And so BirdCast is a revolutionary project that aims to understand how, when, and the distance at which birds are migrating, right? Really unlocking all of those secrets that have largely been invisible to us. And so he's been developing new technologies and tools, everything from using radar, weather radar to machine learning in order to address this area of study. And so we'll be hearing today about how BirdCast is being used to really advance our understanding of migration and also to develop new tools that can help us to conserve birds, to take advantage of more recreational opportunities, to watch birds, and also even protect human health and well-being. So we're really excited again to have Andrew here to share with us today more about his BirdCast project. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you to the Migrations Initiative for hosting this, and thank you to all of you that are out there joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. So as Amanda said, I'll be talking about a project called BirdCast today, and trying to give some perspective not only on bird migration in a new era of incredible computer science and big data, but also think about how bird migration embodies this notion of connectivity, of reimagining where organisms are on the planet and how those places where organisms are interconnected and change actually over time. So the BirdCast project, if you ever look at our website, has this wonderful image on it, this sort of hero image from Charlie Harper. It's called Mystery of the Missing Migrants. And the whole idea of this really is to capture this notion that even though we understand quite a lot about bird migration, there is still a lot that we don't know. And much of this movement occurs under the cover of darkness. I'll come back to that. As a little bit more generality about the project, really at its core, BirdCast is about the collaboration between ornithologists like me and computer scientists to try to unlock this incredible information that we have about migration that's now available to us from people birding around the world, all kinds of new technologies and sensors that are both monitoring birds indirectly from afar, like radar that I'll talk about in a minute, and also sensors on birds themselves that track where the individuals go. So this really rich source of knowledge is something that we really needed as ornithologists to have computer scientists to help take advantage of. So that's really at the core of the BirdCast project. Another component of this project, why we do it, what is the motivation? Yes, I am a birder at heart. I am a scientist. I am also a conservationist and deeply concerned about tremendous declines in bird populations, particularly migratory populations. If we think about nearly 3 billion birds lost from the planet over the last 50 years, migratory birds dominate that number, thinking about 2 out of 5 of every orioles, this wonderful bright orange and black bird that you see on the screen here. These kinds of population declines are alarming for many, many reasons. And one of the driving forces behind BirdCast and the work that I do and my colleagues do is to try to understand the science of why this is happening and then be able to connect that science to action to make changes. Let me pull way out for a minute and think about one of the reasons that these declines are occurring for migratory populations and birds generally. Think about where humans are on the planet and the footprint of humans on the planet. It is global, obviously, in our presence, and that presence is not distributed evenly. So the idea of where people are and then where birds and other organisms are. This is obviously inextricably linked. So too, where humans are observant, they are great sensors, if you will, and when it comes to humans that are interested in birds, this image kind of exemplifies the presence of where people go and the lengths to which they will go to observe and report their sightings. This is an image that actually has every dot on it is an observation from a particular person or a series of people or a group of people around the globe. That's part of the eBird project, and every one of these dots represents an observation of birds. There are no geopolitical boundaries drawn on this graphic. This is only where people have reported birds. And as you can see, the outlines very well define continents. They define shipping routes or cruise ship routes. There are islands around the world where people have spent a lot of time. There are places where you would imagine nobody might ever spend time, where people have gone to look at birds. And then there are some places where there are no observations reported. So the idea here of the human footprint, and the human footprint both as something that interferes and interacts with the natural world and birds in particular, but also supports our understanding of where birds are and what they're doing. These are very complementary concepts. And from this eBird project, this citizen science project that's gathering tremendous amounts of information, closing in on 1 billion observations, we can do some amazing things to understand where birds are during their annual cycle, so during the year. In this case, what you're seeing is a really amazing graphic that takes these observations and models them and creates these distribution maps of where birds are in space and time throughout the year. So in this case, the songbird you see on the right side of the image, a black pole warbler, this is a bird that spends much of its northern hemisphere winters in the tropics in the Amazon, and then very quickly in the spring migrates north and breeds in the boreal reaches far, far in the extreme of Canada and Alaska, only to return to those tropical regions later on in the year. All of this information that you see on this map is gathered from these citizen scientists, these people that are birding around the world. And the information that we can glean from this about where these warblers spend their time during the day and what their movements are over the course of the year are incredibly powerful, both capturing the magnitude of the migration that birds are moving and the distances that they're traveling, where and when they spend time in particular places, and also the kinds of variation that occurs across the year, and then also where the places are that might be important for us to think about conserving them. So this really runs the gamut of birding as a pursuit of people that are interested in seeing these organisms, to the science behind it, to the conservation action. But the reason I highlight this not only is for this sort of comprehensive understanding, but to represent that we know a lot about where birds are during the day and where they spend time, but bird migration is about quite a bit more than that. So given approximately 10,000, a little over 10,000 birds in the world, approximately 20% of them migrate. And in North America, of the 1,000 or so species that are here, about 70% of those migrate. Now, of those North American birds that migrate, 80% of them migrate at night. So the idea of understanding where those birds are in the day is only a part of our knowledge about where birds spend their time and how they actually move when they're migrating. So as you can imagine, the nocturnal piece, the component of migration that occurs when birds are moving at night, that can be a lot more challenging to understand. And one of the ways we do that is very different from citizen science observations from people going out and going birding, but something that we call remote sensing, if you will, indirect study through technology of where birds are in space and time. And in this case, imagine this remote sensing with a network of stations around the country, sensors, if you will, in particular, weather surveillance radars. And there are about 143 of them in the continental and the contiguous US. And they provide to us all sorts of incredible information about what's happening in the atmosphere. Now, this includes, of course, where precipitation is, where it's raining intensively. For example, in this image where the very blocky reds and irregular patterns of yellows and greens are occurring. It also provides information about other phenomena in the atmosphere, including biological activity, which is represented here by all of this more uniform blue and green pattern. And this image from May 15 happens to be dominated by birds. So radar happens to be an incredibly useful tool for studying all of these different aspects of the environment, of the atmosphere. And if we could take advantage of some kinds of new technologies to remove the weather, now colored in white here, and talk only about biology, that would make an incredibly powerful network for us to survey where birds are at night, how many of them are migrating, what altitudes and directions they're moving, what speeds, how their movements are related to weather. And because this radar sensor network has been operating for 25 years, how these patterns have changed over time. So a real treasure trove of information if we could extract that kind of signal of bird migration from all the other things that these weather radars detect. This is where the computer science collaboration comes in, and we've now been able to do that very recently in the last few years, and I'll talk about some of the science that we've learned now as a result of that. This graphic takes away all of that meteorology, that blocky irregular pattern, and summarizes the bird migration patterns over the last 24 years. So what we're seeing here is the result of this ornithology computer science collaboration, and we're seeing the pulse of bird migration in the spring, its intensity in this heat map with the brighter colors being more intense migration, the larger circles being more dense migration, and the arrows pointing in the direction toward which birds are moving. So you see that pulse in the spring, a tremendous number of birds moving through the center of the US, and then in the fall, a return through the center a little bit farther east, generally bird migration in the continental US. The eastern part of the U.S. to the east of the Rockies dominates in terms of where these birds occur and where these pulses occur, but it is nationwide. And you'll notice that these patterns are particularly dense in April and May, and then again really here in September and October. So this is the result of some of that work with the computer scientists that now allow us to understand where and when these movements are happening and start to get a handle on their magnitudes. And speaking of that, one of the things we can do is on an annual basis think about, well, how many birds are there migrating over the contiguous US over the course of a spring and a fall? And in the spring, you'll see two arrows pointing north, birds that are passing a southern transect and birds that are passing a northern transect. And you'll see that those numbers represent about 2.5 to 3.5 billion birds. So this is a large number of organisms. This is a massive movement of biology that occurs every spring. These birds are returning to breed. So obviously past the southern transect, those 3.5 billion, some of them stop along the way before crossing that northern transect, and another 2.5 billion or so continue into the boreal regions of the continent. In the fall, you'll notice the numbers are bigger. You'll see the orange arrows pointing down to represent those southerly movements. About 4 billion birds crossing that northern transect, and about close to 5 billion birds crossing the southern transect. So these numbers are bigger because, of course, these birds have been successful during their reproductive seasons and have offspring that are traveling. But this kind of a graphic that tells us we're talking about 2.5 to 5 billion birds aloft over the US every year was an eye-opener to us, one of the first real quantifications that allowed us to understand, well, how many birds are there in the system every year? We can also look at this from a slightly different perspective. In this case, thinking about the number of birds that come into the US in the Gulf of Mexico region. So as you saw from that blackpoll warbler animation that I showed you, there are many birds that spend their winters in tropical America, and they return to the US through various means, either migrating around the Gulf of Mexico, or many of them over the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. And the numbers that pass over there, it's approximately 2 billion birds that cross this transect. So really dominating the spring movement that you just saw on the previous slide are birds that are arriving through this area. And one of the interesting features of this graphic that you see here, you'll notice the numbers of birds in billions on the y-axis and the calendar date on the x-axis. So in particular, I want to call your attention to that narrow band of 19 days between April 19 and May 7, when about 50% of that 2 billion birds migrates across the Gulf of Mexico and past this transect. So the intensity of this movement, that half of that movement occurs over a 19-day period, is important. It's important for the birders in us that want to go out and see when peak migration occurs. It's important to the scientists among us that want to understand, well, how do we characterize how birds move in space and time, and what are the important periods of the annual cycle? And it's obviously important for the conservationists in us to understand, well, if humans were to alter their activities, when might the greatest bang for the buck occur in terms of the largest number of birds over the smallest period of time? One of the other things that we can do with this great data set that we're now extracting from the weather radar is look at how migration has changed over time. So since the mid-1990s, taking a look at the dates of bird migration in terms of when the passage occurs, what the median date of passage is. So on the y-axis in the left part of the graphic here, you see the day of the year, okay? And on the right, you'll reference 25 April, 30 April, 5 May, 10 May. And then across the x-axis on that right panel, left panel, you'll see the year. You'll notice that the general trend is for the dates to get earlier and earlier over time. So one of the things that we're seeing here, and we see it with many organisms, is that the phenology, the pattern of the timing of bird migration, is shifting earlier across the continent. Now, in this case, these different color bands represent different latitudes, so it's actually changing at different rates over the course of space and time. So in the northern latitudes, these dates are shifting earlier to a greater extent than in the southern latitudes. And we can now quantify this from looking at the bird passage on weather surveillance radar. And what we're talking about here in terms of change over time, on the right-hand part of this panel, it's just an indication of what the degree of change is in days per decade. So again, looking at the top of the graph in the far northern latitudes, that change is approximately 1.5 days per year earlier, where at the lower range, the lower latitudes, actually the change is much closer to zero. There's a lot lower change. This may not seem like a lot, but think about it from the perspective of something changing in human perspectives. Christmas, the date of Christmas, December 25. If every 10 years we shifted the date of Christmas earlier by a day, right? In only a few years, in a few decades, we'd start to get back into December 2021. As we got further, Christmas would get earlier and earlier in December and quickly mismatch with what our typical calendar date for Christmas was relative to the date of this kind of a shift represented by what you're seeing here. So even though a day and a half may seem like a lot, over time, it's actually quite significant. And now we can quantify that. Now, we can also do some other very cool things with these data sets. We can take this radar information and start to learn models to predict when migration will occur. So take the radar data that we can quantify. We can start to learn associations between the patterns of bird migration on those radar data with weather forecasts and weather variables, and we can then create bird migration forecasts. This should look to you very similar to something you see perhaps on the Weather Channel or whatever your typical source of weather information is. This kind of a forecast map is a compelling way of saying where is the intense migration occurring, in this case where the very bright colors are, and the lower intensities where the very cool colors are. This forecast map turns out to be quite a wonderful opportunity to inform people about when birds are moving where. In this animated GIF, you're seeing that on the night of September 23rd, 2020, almost 600 million birds were forecast to migrate over the contiguous US. And then each of these snapshots of different regions of the country, you can see where those migrations were going to occur. So it's not evenly distributed, but this mass of birds is concentrated in the center of the country, in particular the South Central region, the Great Plains, part of the Southeast and the Midwest, Mississippi Valley. The notion of this huge movement of birds is something that can capture people's attention. Again, there's value in the science, in the outreach, and in the education potential. We also can then look at in nearly real time, well, how did this model do? Where are birds actually? So even though this is obviously long after 28 September 2020, this kind of a graphic, this live migration map occurs on the BirdCast website within minutes of the data being collected on the radar. And what you're seeing here, the arrows represent the directions the birds are moving. The intensity of the colors represent where the intensity of migration is. So in this case, the bright yellows and whites, very high intensity movements. And you'll notice a good correspondence between where the forecast of birds' movements were to occur and where they actually occurred. Now, taking this concept of the science we can do and the technology we can use to study bird migration, I want to pull out a little bit and start to think about the implications for these movements of birds in space and time, their connectivity with areas around the globe, and again, thinking about citizenship in terms of where birds spend their time. Where are they over the course of the year? How does this pattern play out globally in different ways? That's something we can start to understand from the perspective of using tools like weather surveillance radar. And one of the ways we can apply that science, for example, to this term called Aero Conservation, thinking about that airspace where birds are is actually a habitat. It satisfies many of the characters, many of the attributes of habitat, just like a tree or any particular biome like a prairie or a forest. Birds are using this particular region of the planet to move, to feed, to do all sorts of different behaviors. And that this airspace as habitat is connected to the terrestrial ecosystems we know about, to the aquatic ecosystems we know about, and understanding these kinds of connectivities, and that the airspace in particular is a medium through which birds connect terrestrial habitats all around the planet, is something that we'd like to do increasingly. And it's a way to start to embody this kind of connectivity and the nature of these relationships in a more comprehensive way. And in the bottom right panel here, you'll see that there are not just weather surveillance radar networks in the US, they are distributed all over the planet. So the concept of creating forecasts and live maps, of analyzing changes over time in populations, of quantifying and characterizing where movements occur and when and how intense they are, that's something that's possible around the globe. We can do other exciting things with these data as well. For example, relate where birds are in the atmosphere to human activities like aviation. Birds and planes do not mix very well. When a plane hits a bird, there is often a significant problem, either in terms of the maintenance required to have that plane operational and the cost, and unfortunately, in the case of some collisions, fatalities of people. Now, in the case of this image here, thankfully there were no fatalities. This is representing the miracle on the Hudson, so to speak, that happened just over a decade ago in New York, where this aircraft hit a flock of Canada geese. The pilot managed to incredibly land the plane in the Hudson River. Everybody was safe. We can now understand these relationships between bird migration traffic and where birds are spending time and where aviation is occurring, and see that, well, when bird migration intensity is high, the number of bird strikes, the planes hitting birds also increases. The potential is there to create predictions forecasts, if you will, for when risks and severity for bird collisions with aircraft are high or low, something that could be incredibly useful for the aviation industry and obviously from a human perspective as well. We also can think about not only birds, but I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that weather surveillance radar also detects other biological activity in the atmosphere. So that includes birds, bats, insect, pollen. So in this case, if we think about insects, maybe some of you remember a story from about 1.5 years ago when literally a plague of grasshoppers invaded Las Vegas, if you will. We could see that occurring on radar, and insect patterns, insect emergences, insect movements are part of the patterns that we can characterize on radar as well. So the potential to think about studying other organisms and their movements, which are very different in some respects and very similar in others to bird migration, is a real potential with weather surveillance radar as well. So too, coming back to birds, is thinking about zoonotic disease. So birds, as we know, do transmit disease sometimes. Avian influenza, H5N1, for example, is something that we know travels with birds, and understanding a little bit about how that organism travels in birds and then where birds are traveling obviously has some very important potential ramifications for biosurveillance, security. When is it important, for example, if you're a poultry farmer, to protect your chickens from the arrival of birds that may be transmitting avian flu? Thinking again about understanding in advance when these patterns are occurring to respond to them. And so too also the transmission of diseases globally by understanding where and when birds are moving. It goes beyond simply the understanding of where and when birds are migrating from radar. It encompasses other information as well, including some of the sensors that are on birds and tracking individuals. But this kind of powerful data, this is the raw currency of understanding how these kinds of connectivities and how these transmissions occur across the globe. In addition, we can think about bird conservation from the perspective of birds' experience and travel through airspace, as I mentioned. Human activity changes airspace in many ways. Yes, we talked about aircraft, but let's also talk about structures, including skyscrapers, communications towers, anything like part of the electrical grid, wind turbines. All of these sorts of things, as we expand them up into the airspace, they interact with birds. And when birds collide with them, unfortunately, large numbers of birds die. Upwards of 1 billion birds every year are killed in collisions with structures like this. Many of these structures the collisions are associated with light pollution, or light pollution drawing birds into areas where they are in hazards. Let me talk a little bit about this. So light pollution, relatively sort of from an evolutionary perspective, is something very new for most organisms. If you think about lighthouses, oil burning lighthouses, yes, in the 18th and 19th centuries, those were the kinds of illumination that were possible at night, and they attracted birds. There are many accounts of large numbers of birds being attracted to these lighthouses. Of course, when electrification occurred, for example, at the Columbian Exposition at the first Electric World's Fair in Chicago in 1893, that was a whole different level of attractive capabilities. The electrification, artificial light pollution, beginning late in the 19th century and expanding dramatically into the 20th century, is a whole new kind of stimulus for nocturnally active animals. So what happens, birds are disoriented by light at night and they are attracted to it. So the challenges of illuminating the nocturnal setting when birds are moving, with the evolutionary history that birds have, with all of the tools that they can use, the sensory capabilities to migrate at night, light influences that dramatically. And unfortunately, the effects are rather extreme. I mentioned 1 billion collisions every year, that are upwards of 1 billion collisions that are associated with birds striking buildings. Many of these are associated with light in one way or another, either direct attraction or disorientation and putting birds in hazardous spaces where then they collide the next day. The numbers are staggering, the diversity is staggering. So one of the ideas, again, embodied by BirdCast, is that we want to take this science that we can now do with the radar characterizations and quantifications and turn that into some kind of conservation action where we can start to prevent activities like this. What I'm showing you here, this video, even though it looks like snowflakes or insects perhaps coming to light, these are birds. These are small songbirds. These are mostly warblers, for those that know birds well: American redstart, ovenbird, black and white warbler, northern parula. These are birds that are attracted to and disoriented by the tribute in light, the annual memorial to the lives lost on September 11th, 2001 during the terrorist attacks. This event occurs in southern Manhattan, and the intensity of this light every year that it's on and there are birds migrating attract birds. So what you're seeing here represents, in this case, at any one snapshot of this video, it's about 1,500 to 2,000 birds in this field of view. So it's a large number of birds, upwards of 10 or 20,000 birds may be attracted to and disoriented by the light. Now, if we were able to, for example, work with the organizers and producers of these lights to mitigate some of this attraction by turning the lights on and off, which the producers and organizers have been incredibly responsive and supportive in agreeing to do this, we see an incredible pattern. In this case, on this graphic, I want to orient you to where the green is when the lights are on, where the gray is, the lights are off. This is a particular night in 2015, and what you're looking at on the right-hand side of the x-axis is where the evening begins at sunrise, and then approximately 9 hours later, sunset, approximately 9 hours later at sunrise, when obviously the night comes to an end. You'll notice that these graphics show this incredible periodicity. Increases during the lights on period, decreases during the lights off period, and increases in A, the number of birds that are there, B, decreases in the speeds that birds are traveling, and C, increases in the calling rate, in the communication that birds are using. Again, all associated with when the lights are on, and then a dramatic opposite change when the lights are off. This kind of periodicity exemplifies this pattern of attraction and disorientation, that when the lights are on, large numbers of birds aggregate in the light, they slow down and start to be disoriented and attracted to the light further. They also communicate more when they're disoriented. When the lights turn off for even 20 minutes, the birds disperse, the calling diminishes, the communication stops, birds move on, and the speeds increase. So the idea behind this monitoring at the tribute in light was that we were able to understand what a powerful light source like this, even in an incredibly light polluted city like New York, what it could mean just to mitigate lights on and off. We also have a very new study that's just in review right now, looking at a similar kind of a pattern of attraction and disorientation and collisions relative to bird migration in Chicago. In this case, a particular building at McCormick Place, a convention center that's long operated there. A tremendous effort by members of the Field Museum and volunteer crews to monitor bird collisions and bird mortality at this site over 40 years, and then look over the last 20 years at comparing that collision mortality with various different attributes to try to understand, well, what role does light play? What role does migration intensity, bird traffic play in terms of nocturnal movements of birds? What role do some weather variables play, like wind? And in this case, one of the things we see very clearly on the y-axis, we're looking at collisions. On the x-axis, we're looking at different variables. Window illumination, whether windows are lighted or not, a tremendously strong predictor of whether birds collide with those windows. So again, the light attracting and disorienting birds. Additionally, thinking about collisions, that the greater the light, the greater the number of collisions, the more intense the migration, the larger the number of collisions, And when it comes to east-west wind, which is called zonal wind for those of you meteorologists out there, the more positive values there represent more westerly winds. So with more winds blowing from the west, we also see increase in collisions. And you'll notice that there are differences between spring and fall. This is one of the ways that we start to tease apart what these important correlates are, these important predictors of when collisions may be occurring, how light and mitigating the patterns of light and human behavior associated with light may actually impact birds for the best. We can also take that kind of knowledge and apply it to an alerting system. So using that forecast model to say, when is there going to be high intensity bird migration, and what would be a good night to turn out lights in order to have the maximal effect with the minimal effort to conserve birds potentially, to prevent these kinds of hazardous situations where birds are attracted and disoriented to light. We've been working for the past year in Texas on a pilot campaign called Lights Out Texas that started in Houston and Dallas, and now is continuing in the spring of this year to include San Antonio, Austin, Galveston, and a few other cities. We've worked closely with a number of partners in Texas, including former First Lady Laura Bush, who's been an incredible advocate on our behalf, to promote this kind of scientific approach that uses the bird migration forecast to say when migration intensity is going to be above a certain level, to then highlight to people, this would be a good night to act and turn off your lights. A very simple kind of solution to a potentially complex problem that could have tremendously positive ramification in terms of taking the science to an action that can prevent bird mortality. Now, to end, I want to highlight here that there are many partners involved in this research that I've been talking about today. There are partners at Colorado State University and University of Massachusetts, Amherst, that are both on the biology side and on the computer science side. It's also work that's been funded by a combination of federal and private dollars, and the partnerships that we've had among a large array of incredibly talented groups of people include some names that you probably recognize very well: Amazon, Microsoft, NOAA, NASA, United States Geological Survey, and then of course the partners in Texas for some of the work that I just mentioned. So with this, I want to conclude by saying again, thank you for listening today. I'm happy that you're in the audience. I very much appreciate the opportunity to discuss the BirdCast project and to talk about all of the exciting science and outreach that we're doing. And I can also offer that a PDF version of this presentation is going to be available after we finish for you to review if you would like. And I'd be happy to take any kinds of questions you have and any comments that you have. I'd love to hear them. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Andrew. That was an amazing talk. It's just incredible to see how much is possible now with this new technology. So yeah, thank you. So we do have, for our first question, Eleanor asked two questions, actually. One was, how does extreme weather affect bird migration, both in short-term responses, but also over longer terms? And then the second question is thinking more about from the perspective of Texas and what's happening there. And so how do these power outages and these local storms, how are those perhaps affecting the habits of birds and their movements more locally?
Eleanor, that's a great set of questions. Let me see if I can answer them for you. So from the perspective of extreme weather, birds respond often very quickly to extreme weather, whether it's hurricanes or whether it's very strong thunderstorms, cold snaps. You can absolutely see birds respond. When it comes to hurricanes, for example, they often transport or displace birds tremendous distances. Birds may travel with the storms, sometimes thousands and thousands of kilometers, and end up in places far afield from where they originated. In many cases, these birds may actually return to places where they began. This is often the case with many seabirds, but also many birds perish because of this as well, ending up in places far from where they started. So there's no question that we can see rapid responses in behaviors of birds and their distributions as a function of lots of different kinds of extreme weather. And another example, let me take you back to the fall, late summer and fall of 2020. Extreme weather in the western US, anomalously hot summer. An anomalously dry summer, off the charts really in many areas, a tremendous western wildfire season. There were many, many instances of bird mortality later in the late summer and early fall that were a function of birds responding to these kinds of conditions of drought, heat, lack of food, poor air quality, also a tremendously anomalous winter storm that occurred in the Rockies right around the time birds were migrating. So these kinds of responses, yes, birds are able to adjust and move with them sometimes. Yes, it also causes mortality at some times. Now, to focus specifically on what's happening in Texas right now, we are also seeing birds move and respond relative to these incredible, unprecedented cold conditions. One of the species we were just looking at recently in the last few days is a bird called fox sparrow. And fox sparrow is quite an incredible, very large sparrow, very bright red, quite a bright rufous, quite a powerful looking songbird, if you will. These birds responded in the last few days to these incredible cold temperatures by moving south. That even though we're in this period in February or March where fox sparrow is generally going to start moving north, they are an early migrant. These birds responded to the cold by moving south, trying to escape these kinds of extreme, adverse, very local conditions. So again, this kind of response on the very local scale in time and space absolutely is something we see with birds relative to extreme weather. Can they manage to avoid it at times? Yes. Does it cause mortality at times, including in Texas right now? Absolutely.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And I'll just remind all those viewing that you're able to submit questions if you double click on the chat box. So please feel free to do that. So our next question is from Eric. And he was wondering, are leg bans on birds, so bird banding, is that still helpful now? You know, is it useful given these other approaches that we can use to study migration?
Eric, thank you for the question. Bird banding is absolutely useful in so many ways. Everything from being able to recover those bands, and the more bands we put on birds to understand where birds are going and when they're appearing, and also information about the bird itself in terms of its body condition, what its feather wear and feather molt and feather conditions are. All of this is incredibly useful to us still, even though we have advancing technologies of actually being able to put sensors on birds that may collect all sorts of digital information. The very simple approach of putting leg bands on birds or neck bands or other kinds of information that we can see if we capture a bird again, or sometimes see from afar if you're an observer, it's absolutely invaluable. There is absolutely still a place for it, very much the same way that there is a place for citizen scientists going out and submitting observations with binoculars. Sure, you can take pictures, critically important. You can record birds with video and audio, super important. Having this kind of banding information and visual observation, that is raw currency for science still, no question. And in fact, in many respects, that record of banding information is really we've only scratched the surface in terms of analyzing it. That's something that in the coming years, some colleagues and a number of scientists are thinking about ways to dig even deeper now that we have all of this additional kinds of information from observations, from these kinds of remote sensors. Relating that to banding is incredibly powerful. So good question, absolutely still useful, very important to do.
Great, thank you. And our next question is from Jamie, and I think this is in relation to a lot of the lights out focus and collisions. You know, you were emphasizing some of these really large light sources, right? Large buildings or the tribute. And so Jamie's question is, does window illumination from living room lights, for example, so just within individual households, is that affecting migrating birds? And what can just regular individuals do to help reduce collisions of birds in residential areas?
Jamie, thank you for that question. Yes, there's no doubt that even single windows that are illuminated at night can be a problem. Many of those upwards of 1 billion collisions that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, many of those happen at single-story residences, households that have living room windows or rooms that may be illuminated at night. Turning these lights off is incredibly valuable. It's just important. It's important at every level to realize that something as simple as extinguishing those lights can have a dramatic effect on reducing bird collisions. That's something that we've seen in cities when it comes to buildings. The Chicago work that I mentioned, talking about individual bays of windows being illuminated and associated with greater risks of collision. Turning off those lights, flipping the switch, if you will, a very, very simple action potentially that could have dramatic effects. So it's important, yes, to think about these very bright sources, these intense areas of illumination as incredibly attractive and disorienting, of course, absolutely. The same is true for urban areas, these incredible urban glows that you see from New York and Chicago and Dallas and Houston and other cities in the US and around the globe. Yes, those are attractive to birds and disorienting. We've seen the results of greater than expected numbers and diversity of migrants in those kinds of urban habitats in the fall in particular, when young birds are often attracted more and disoriented more than adults. That kind of bright light is one thing. No question the pattern exists for these kinds of single source illuminations as well. And even what seems like not necessarily very bright illumination in places where there is not a lot of light. For example, greenhouses in remote areas, electrical infrastructure in places where there aren't a lot of people. It turns out that can be incredibly important in terms of the attractive and disorienting effects of light pollution. So every window definitely matters. Every place that we can eliminate light at night, that especially non-essential light, that is critically important and an action that we can all do.
Thanks, Andrew. And I'll just jump in with a quick follow-up. I'm curious, with the lights out programs and with interacting with, just with homeowners, do you find that people are more receptive to turning out lights when they're able to, have these sort of precise forecasts that allow them to concentrate sort of these adjustments, rather than saying, well, the whole migration season, we need to turn down lights every night?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that yet. I know that people are certainly receptive to thinking about anything that they can do that's easier rather than harder, no doubt. But we're actively looking at that relationship between, well, how many nights would you need to turn out your lights, for example, to affect or not affect 50% of the migration, relative to what would that time period look like if you just accumulated the number over a particular window of time. We're starting to look at that trade-off. Our assumption was that people would actually, individuals perhaps, would actually like fewer days to do that, of course, a lower lift, if you will, in terms of their effort to get more impact. We're not sure that that's the case. In some respects, it seems that people may also just want to turn them off once and leave them off and not think about it again, and just understand, rather than from the perspective of, oh, there's going to be a big movement tomorrow night or 3 nights from now, I'm going to remember to turn my lights off. The other perspective of, oh, okay, I know that during this period from the 19th of April to the 7th of May, there's going to be a huge migration. I'm just going to turn off for the whole time so I don't have to think about it anymore. I've done my good deed and I'm not going to worry about it any further. I'm good. We see both of those things, and I think it's kind of a trade-off depending on where you are, exactly how you think about the science, and probably how engaged you are. We're hoping that we're going to engage people to the level that they're just going to want to do this broadly and say, less light pollution over longer periods of time, thumbs up for that.
Right. Yeah, that's so interesting. It actually reminds me of, some of the research we hear about habit, right? The power of just habits. And so you can see there's that trade-off, the more precision, but then it's not really a habit. It's not, that's cool. Yeah, so our next question is from Paul, and the question is how, and really hearkening back, I think, to the initial context for the talk and the loss of almost 3 billion birds since 1970. And the question is, how does the rapid decrease in birds affect ecosystems?
Paul, an excellent question. Thank you for asking that. So let me try to answer that in a couple of different ways. From the perspective of ecosystems and the kinds of activities and services that birds provide in those ecosystems, whether it's their position in consuming tremendous numbers of insects, behaving as pollinators, controlling certain populations of other organisms, their interactions are wide, they are large. So as you start to remove pieces of ecosystems in these kinds of ways, the instability increases. And when the instability increases, we don't necessarily know all of the things that happen, but we do know that there are absolutely some negative feedbacks there and changes in ecosystems that we can see. So the thought of, as you might hear the euphemism of the canary in the coal mine, which is a very valid one. Birds are sensitive to these kinds of changes in the environment. And when you start seeing these kinds of changes and exacerbating these kinds of changes, you know that that's a good proxy for understanding ecosystem health. So definitely that has an effect. We're only starting to understand all of the kinds of services that these kinds of organisms, that birds play in systems. And part of the reason that I think it's so important to start to think about the connectivity between airspace and terrestrial habitats and ecosystems, aquatic systems, and where those are on the planet, and that birds are connecting these in many different ways, in timescales of days, years, decades. The understanding of how those kinds of losses propagate through those, it's only something we're beginning to scratch the surface. But the concept of major potential ecosystem effects absolutely is something that is very real, no question. Now, from another perspective, what does that mean in terms of our perception of the systems and people engaging with birds and the loss of birds? Birds are a key aspect of the way that humans engage with their world. They have beautiful songs, they look pretty, they do fun things, they have lots of interesting behaviors. So when we start to lose species and populations from these systems, there's an opportunity there for people to understand this is important to me, and this translates into a way for me to directly engage with what these losses mean. It's an opportunity to, yes, recognize what the science is, and that when you start to pull species out of these systems into which they've evolved over many hundreds of thousands or millions of years, that's one piece of the puzzle, that motivating people to understand what that means and what it means personally, and then how those two things interact. It's an incredible opportunity to instruct people and also to really realize, well, okay, my actions or my species actions have tremendous implications. So it's a teachable series of moments. It's an important way to think about gathering information and monitoring what's going on in our world and everything in between.
Thanks. And actually, Andrew, I think that connects really well to tee up the next question from Ketty about, what's the potential to use BirdCast then to really try to understand the consequences of very specific kinds of threats to birds, like agriculture in particular was the focus of this question.
That's a great question. I think the potential is very large. I think, and I think that for a couple of reasons. One of the concepts that really I think BirdCast captures very well is this notion of scale, and scale in space and scale in time, and being able to study different patterns of bird migration at these different scales. So being able to look, for example, over approximately 25 years, starting to characterize bird migration in different places, from individual radars where they're sampling in the hundreds of kilometer radii around the stations, to the entire network. We can look at patterns of change. There are certain radar scans, for example, those that occur just after sunset, that capture during migration when birds come up into the atmosphere and by association from where those birds have originated. So the idea of capturing information about where they're stopping over, where they're spending time, what kinds of habitats are associated with those areas, and how that's changed over time. The potential to think about, well, what effect has growing agriculture or changing land use in a particular area of the US had on migration traffic, and then being able to extrapolate from there. So too, thinking about a project we've been discussing recently related to the increase in wildfires, aerial pollution. How does this kind of change to the atmosphere affect movements of birds, and how might that be a model for understanding, well, what does it mean if fires are increasing and fire ecology is changing and landscapes are changing? How is that going to translate into bird populations and then beyond into ecosystems going forward with projections 5, 10, 20 years out? So the idea of thinking about BirdCast as a means, yes, to do exciting observations, to engage people and say, oh, there's a big movement coming, to do some exciting science that just characterizes and relates different features of the environment, this connectivity. And then 3, thinking about, well, how can we apply that in these different areas, as you saw with BirdCast aviation models, zoonotic disease, sure, land use change and landscape change, wildfire changes, climate change, all of these different pieces at scale in space and time. That's absolutely something that I see as an integral part of BirdCast going forward, the application of the science in these cases, whether it's agriculture or epidemiology or aviation.
Great, thanks. That's so exciting and so needed. So for our last question then, Andrew, we have one from Jason, and the question is about Moonlight. And what do we know about the role of moonlight in migratory behavior? And I guess what's the difference? Do we really understand the different outcomes from natural versus artificial lights? And I'm going to let you know you only have about a minute.
Okay, very good. So Moonlight, even though we know, let me talk about Moonlight in a couple ways. One is there actually is this incredible opportunity to study bird migration by moonlight, by looking at the face of the full moon with optics and actually counting the numbers of birds, and then doing some math, some trigonometry to quantify how much migration traffic there is. That's one of the ways that we were first able to know how to use radar data. We calibrated radar data with watching birds against the face of the full moon, one of the ways anyway. So a little aside. In terms of birds responding to the full moon, absolutely, there are changes in the ways birds behave, but the understanding at some kind of detailed level of, well, does a full moon alter patterns of migration? Are there changes that we can see in terms of the lunar cycle? We're still looking at that. We don't think that the changes are terribly dramatic. The assumption is that they are not, that it's a very different kind of an experience for birds than these bright illuminations that we see from cities, both in terms of the wavelengths of light that come from artificial sources relative to the moon and the intensity. But to some extent, that is just an assumption. So we don't necessarily want to base all of our thinking on it. We still have quite a bit of opportunity, and it's one of the projects we've talked about for a little while, looking in detail, or do we see any real changes from a nocturnal migration perspective and those kinds of behaviors when we have lunar illumination? We'll look at it. We don't think that there's anything dramatic happening there, say relative to other behaviors in which birds engage during the year. For example, birds feeding under certain conditions in moonlight or not. That's a very different situation. From the migration perspective, we're going to look at it. We don't think there's a big story there, but we don't know for certain. And I don't want to be the one to make the assumption that nothing is happening there.
Great. Well, thanks. Well, thank you so much. It's just been a fascinating hour, Andrew. Really appreciate you sharing about the BirdCast project and spending this time with us today. Thanks so much. I also want to thank the staff at Cornell for setting up and organizing and running this keynote, as well as the Migrations Initiative for really making this forum possible. And thank you to everyone who's taken the time to join us today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to engaging with you on another time.
Thank you so much.